The Sidoarjo Mud Volcano, or just Lumpur Lapindo in Indonesian, started erupting on May 29, 2006. It began near a gas exploration site where a local oil and gas company had been drilling for weeks. There were small odd signs initially as small cracks started splitting the ground and faint trails of steam rising from the soil. But within days, those cracks started spewing out hot mud. And by the end of the week, multiple new vents formed across the area. The mud quickly swallowed rice fields, then homes, then roads, and at its peak, it was erupting at a rate of over 180,000 cubic meters a day. That's enough to fill 72 Olympic-sized swimming pools daily. Within a month, more than 10,000 people had been displaced. That number would keep climbing. Entire villages had to be evacuated, and the eruption didn't stop. It kept flowing, and it still is, nearly 2 decades later. This is the story of the Sidoarjo Mud Volcano, one of the worst industrial disasters in history. On that fateful day, a local company called Lapindo Brantas was drilling an exploratory gas well called Banjar Panji-1. The drill bit had just reached 2,800 meters, deep enough to disturb overpressurized formations when the first warning signs appeared. Subtle pressure spikes, the kind that would have triggered alarms in a properly cased well, began pulsing through the system. But in the case of Banjar Panji-1, those critical safety measures failed. Investigators later found that the well's casing stopped at 2,350 meters, leaving the final 490 meters completely exposed. When the crew made their fateful decision to retract the drill string without first setting the liner hanger, they essentially yanked the cork from a champagne bottle of superheated mud, a 2,800-meter-high column of pressurized fluids now free to surge upward through the unprotected shaft. Within hours, hot mud began erupting from a fissure 200 meters away. This meant the pressurized mud had fractured the surrounding rock, creating a new path to the surface that bypassed the drill site entirely. Once this channel opened, the eruption became unstoppable. The timing of this disaster also raised some questions, because 2 days before the eruption, a 6.3 magnitude quake struck 280 kilometers away near Yogyakarta in central Java. While some initially suspected a connection, peer-reviewed research proved decisive that the quake's pressure changes were 100 times too weak to trigger the eruption. Multiple investigations later reached the same conclusion, that this was a preventable engineering failure. The incomplete casing, missing pressure barriers, and decision to continue drilling without proper safeguards created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. In the first 24 hours after the eruption began, the mud covered about 4 hectares, roughly the size of 7 football fields. But by day 3, that number had more than doubled. The initial vent near the rice fields expanded quickly, and more vents started appearing nearby. Some erupted with force, others leaked steadily, but they were all connected underground, feeding from the same overpressurized source. The mud was hot, between 70 to 100 degrees Celsius, and it moved slowly, but continuously. By early June, the flow had reached parts of the Parong Highway, a major transportation route in East Java. That was the first major infrastructure threat. Local authorities built embankments to hold the mud back, using sandbags and earth movers, but the volume overwhelmed them. The embankments then collapsed, and the mud kept spreading. And by the end of June, more than 10,000 residents had been displaced. That number continued to climb over the next few months. Local shelters were overcrowded and under-resourced. Some people moved in with family members. Others ended up living in makeshift tents, along the roads, or near the edges of the mudflow zone. By August 2006, the Sidoarjo Mudflow had become a national emergency. Over 20 villages were partially or fully submerged, with the World Bank later confirming these damage assessments. The flow rate was still increasing, and early containment efforts had failed. With the scale of the disaster growing, the Indonesian government stepped in. President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono formed a special task force to manage the situation through presidential decree, initially called the Sidoarjo Mudflow Mitigation Agency, or BPLS for short. Its role was to coordinate containment, handle evacuations, and begin the process of land acquisition and compensation for affected residents. But the situation turned out politically complicated. The company behind the drilling was partly owned by Bakri Group, one of Indonesia's most powerful business conglomerates. At the time, Aburizal Bakri, the head of the Bakri Group, was serving as coordinating minister for the people's welfare in the United Indonesia cabinet. This direct overlap raised serious concerns about conflicts of interest, especially as pressure grew over who should pay for damages. In September 2006, the Indonesian government declared through government regulation that Lapindo was responsible for covering all costs related to the disaster, but only for residents in what they defined as the affected area, a narrow zone covering just 12 villages. This boundary, later referred to as the Map of Responsibility, became immediately controversial as it excluded thousands of victims whose destroyed homes fell just outside the arbitrary line. Those inside the boundary were designated as Phase 1 victims entitled to full compensation, while those outside became known as Phase 2 victims who would spend years fighting for partial payments through ad hoc arrangements. Protests began almost immediately, with residents demanding broader recognition and more transparency around how the map had been drawn. Lapindo Brantas denied liability. Their lawyers argued the eruption was a natural disaster, citing the earthquake again and again, despite a 2008 study having already proven this impossible. But in parallel, they began paying partial compensation to Phase 1 victims, 20% upfront with 80% promised over 2 years according to their 2007 scheme, while Phase 2 victims initially received nothing. The process was slow and often inconsistent. By early 2007, public pressure led to more formal agreements. Lapindo committed to a payment scheme that would cover 100% of the value of lost property, but still only for those inside the official zone. For many Phase 1 families, that meant waiting years just to rebuild their homes, while Phase 2 victims continued to fight for recognition through human rights organizations. The Indonesian government eventually absorbed the cleanup and compensation burden. In 2015, the state budget allocated nearly 781 billion rupiah, or around $55 million under Article 23, to cover the remaining compensation for affected residents, money that had originally been Lapindo's responsibility under the 2007 agreement. The rationale was that it was better to pay the victims than wait for the company to resolve its debts, especially after Tempo magazine reported in 2012 that Lapindo had shifted assets to Minarak Lapindo Jaya to avoid liability. In short, the state stepped in, and Lapindo kept operating. And at the same time, the mud kept spewing. Engineers were brought in to build a ring of levees around the main eruption zone. They also drilled relief wells in an attempt to reduce pressure underground. But none of these measures slowed the eruption. They only contained it, for now. Several engineering teams, both local and international, were brought in to study the site and recommend solutions. But there was no precedent for this kind of eruption. It wasn't a typical mud volcano, it had a deeper source. Most likely a pressured mix of clay, water, and gas from the deeper parts of the Watu Kosek fault system, possibly triggered by casing failure in Lapindo's well, but no one had a full model of what was happening underground. One of the most widely reported interventions came in 2008. Engineers attempted to plug the main vent by dropping thousands of concrete balls into it. Each ball weighed several hundred kilograms and was chained together in long strings. The idea was to create enough resistance in the throat of the eruption to reduce the flow rate without fully sealing it, which could risk triggering new vents elsewhere. Over 400 chains of concrete balls were dropped in over several months. The effort was highly publicized, but ultimately, it didn't work. The mud just kept coming, either bypassing the plugs or forcing new outlets to open nearby. Later geological analysis suggested the pressure source was too deep and too widespread for a surface-level plug to succeed. Other containment measures focused on managing the mud above ground. BPLS expanded the network of levees, building concentric walls around the eruption zone. They also constructed drainage canals and pumping stations to divert the mud to nearby rivers, mainly the Porong River, to prevent flooding elsewhere. This raised new concerns about water contamination and sediment buildup downstream, but it was considered the only viable option to prevent larger-scale displacement. And by the end of 2008, the mud had covered more than 6.5 square kilometers. That included residential areas, farmland, factories, and parts of the Jakarta-Surabaya toll road. Around 40,000 people had been displaced by that point. In 2009, the initial disaster response had transitioned into long-term crisis management. The eruption zone was still active, though the flow had stabilized at about 10,000 cubic meters per day, just 5% of its peak volume. But for the more than 40,000 residents who had lost homes, jobs, and access to their communities, the mud flow wasn't just a geological disaster, it had permanently altered their lives. 16 villages were fully submerged under the mud, with 5 more partially destroyed. Whole neighborhoods, including schools, mosques, factories, and rice fields covering some 12 square kilometers, were wiped off the map. Some of the first people to be displaced were still living in temporary shelters 3 years later. Others were moved into basic housing developments built by the government, often relocated up to 30 kilometers from where they had lived or worked. Many residents never returned to stable living conditions. Employment opportunities dropped sharply, especially for people who had worked in local manufacturing or agriculture. The mud buried not just homes, but the informal economies that had supported them as well. And psychologically, the impact was just as heavy. Surveys would later show that 72% of survivors reported trauma symptoms. Many described long-term distress, distrust of officials, and ongoing fear that the eruption might reactivate or spread. The mud had become a kind of permanent background presence. Though invisible from most of Sidoarjo, its presence loomed large in everyone's awareness. And over time, media coverage slowed down, public attention shifted, but the crater kept steaming, and the evacuees kept waiting for closure, for recognition, for something to mark the end of it. But it never really came. Years later, the mud flow remained a politically sensitive subject. It was rarely brought up in campaigns, despite its scale. Local elections in East Java occasionally revisited the issue, especially around compensation shortfalls, but nationally, it faded into the background. The crater is still monitored today, though officially downgraded from emergency status in 2018. It's a fact of the landscape now. Some locals call it a monument to failure. Others have tried building tourism facilities around the site or organizing art festivals in the mud's shadow. What makes this disaster so hard to discuss is how it seeped into normal life. A few years in, the mud became just another background noise. And for many of the people who were affected, that was maybe the hardest part, being buried once by mud and then again by silence. We still lack a definitive answer about its cause. We might never get one that satisfies everyone, but the crater is still there. The heat underneath it hasn't gone away. Neither has the memory of what was lost. And if there's one thing the Sidoarjo disaster shows us, it's that forgetting something doesn't make it disappear.